Well, hello and welcome to all viewers of this session. My name is Sofia Jimenez Poiré. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a lesbian feminist from Mexico City. I am here today as part of She Decides, which is a global movement driving change for bodily autonomy for women and girls. More specifically, I am part of the She Decides 25 by 25 generation of equality, which is a group of young activists from all over the world, born in 1995, and who are working to uphold the Beijing Platform for Action. Actually, joining us later today will be my colleague Sadie Brown from South Africa. I am also program coordinator at the Mexican NGO Balance, where we focus on sexual and reproductive justice for women and youth. And in my case, especially for sapphic women, which is the term we use for women who are attracted to other women, whether we refer to ourselves as lesbian, bisexual, queer, gay, etc. It is my great pleasure to be the host of this conversation today, which is organized by the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, the Office of the Independent Expert of Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, ILGA World, the Global Queer Youth Network, and She Decides. For the next hour and a half, we will be inviting different speakers to consider how the sexual and reproductive health movements and LGBTIQ movements can join efforts around shared purpose and collaborate more effectively in the decade ahead. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. We have simultaneous translation to French and Spanish. You can choose your preferred language by following the instructions on the chat. If you have any technical issues during the event, the Q&A section is open and we should be able to help you there. For safeguarding reasons, all participants except for the speakers will have their cameras and audio options off. To start off this session, we are happy to have the new executive director to ILGA World, Dr. Julia Eart, sharing her opening remarks for this session. Please, Julia.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you to the co-organizers of ILGA World for inviting me today. It's a real privilege to be speaking to you and to deliver some opening remarks. It as well sits very well with ILGA World's effort to increase our work in regard to LGBTI youth and deliver for the younger parts of our communities, which, as we all know, is as well the future of our movement. So this, I think, sits well with the whole range of activities that we're doing, which will in a certain way culminate in our World Conference next year in May, which is going to be the first World Conference, well, the first World Conference past COVID, but maybe more importantly, the first World Conference that's going to focus in the theme on youth issues. So, and therefore, yeah, it's a privilege and a pleasure to be speaking here today. The outline of this meeting today as well takes reference to the UNFPA publication "My Body is My Own," and I'd like to take this opportunity as well to congratulate UNFPA. I think this report is brilliant, it's bold, and it delivers and elevates and highlights in such an important issue. The report is intersectional, it's trans-inclusive, it's LGBTI inclusive, it speaks positively about sex work. And when I read it for the first time, I was like, yeah, I couldn't believe that UNFPA is putting their foot down in that way on that topic. Of course, I mean, the report takes departure in analyzing to which extent married women can exercise their right of bodily autonomy free of coercion and restriction. And they analyzed 57 states, and of course the results are as well deeply shocking. I won't go into the details of those results. I just want to say maybe the one result that I thought was particularly telling is the fact that UNFPA had identified 3 indicators, and those indicators measure the right to bodily autonomy. And what you would expect is that those 3 indicators are correlated. So that means one indicator gets better, the others get better too, but that's exactly not the case. They're negatively correlated. If, let's say, one indicator, let's say access to contraception gets better, the right of women or the possibility of women to say no to sex gets worse. So what does that tell us? It tells us that decisions on women's bodies are not taken by women. Because otherwise, and it as well tells us that there seems to be no general trend in these general positive trend in these 57 states. And I thought that was, well, both shocking and counterintuitive. I would not have expected it that way. So why am I telling you this? Or phrased otherwise, So what does that have to do with LGBTI people? In particular, as well, LGBTI young people. And again, I think I couldn't express it better than the report says it itself. They say, the issue of bodily autonomy relates to a range of other issues, including abortion, age of consent, surrogacy, sex work, and is of concern for other groups too, such as unmarried women and girls, LGBTI communities, persons with disability, and so on. So I think the topic of bodily autonomy kind of unites at times very, very different human rights movements and brings us to one table. And I don't think you have to, read and understand Foucault in order to understand that the restriction of agency over our own bodies is a very, very powerful tool in order to control us and our communities. And I do believe it gets, in a certain way, even more fundamental than that. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, as we all know. And I would say that there's no life and dignity even possible without the autonomy of our own bodies. Because as well, our own body is the first thing that we are granted when we come into this life. And therefore, without bodily autonomy, there's no dignity. And therefore, bodily autonomy is kind of sits at the center of the core of human rights. And that's why as well, the issue around bodily autonomy brings not only the LGBTI movement, but many other movements like the feminist movement, women's movement, disability movement, to one joint and common table. So therefore, I think the topic of this event today couldn't be chosen better. And in fact, when you think of it, so many of the rights that LGBTI people get denied, so many of the rights that our movements have been fighting for decades, at times several decades, possibly even centuries, they very, very often have a rather direct relation to the question of bodily autonomy. Be it the question around consensual same-sex activity among adults, be it the right to comprehensive sex education, be it the right to self-determination of one's own gender identity, or be it the right to have unchanged or at least unharmed sex characteristics. I mean, all those fundamental areas that our movements plow through have a very direct relation to bodily autonomy and the right to decide of our own bodies. And at the same time, it's like a very old and very core feminist principle to have agency of, well, in this case, of women over their own bodies, and brings us together to one table. And that's why I think it's both strong and timely to discuss. Because at the end of the day, with all the anti-trans and at the times anti-gender movements that we see mushrooming across the world, the right to our bodies is the notion that can unite us against those who want to deny those rights. And therefore, I look very much forward to both seeing a video after I spoke, I heard, and then to listening to my colleagues speaking and unpacking that issue that I could only touch, in a very short type of manner in further detail throughout this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for all these brilliant remarks. I very much agree with everything you said. Bodily autonomy could really be the core of everything that unites our movements, despite many discourses that say that they are not going together or that they are not compatible. So this is fantastic. Thank you for these remarks. And so, yes, we will start our first segment, which is called the implementation of the Nairobi Summit's commitments, the future of SRHR. And we will have a panel with 2 members of the ICPD 25 Commission to reflect on the findings of the progress report, which was launched this week. But before we start, we will have an introductory video, as Julia said, launched by the ICPD 25 Follow-up Secretariat at UNFPA regarding this report. So please, tech team.
In 1994, the landmark International Conference on Population and Development fundamentally changed the way we look at our societies. It put people, rights, and choices at the center. In 2019, people from 172 countries met at the Nairobi Summit to accelerate progress on these promises. Governments, activists, celebrities, business people, youth, and more made over 1,300 commitments to action. These fall under 12 overarching commitments in the Nairobi Statement. After, a high-level commission linking 27 eminent leaders from around the world began tracking the commitments. Each year, the Commission reports on gains and gaps. In 2021, the Commission's first report finds progress on some commitments, but it also sees erosion in sexual and reproductive health and rights. Services have shut down. Finance is short. Political accountability has lagged. This is a failure we cannot afford. It undercuts human rights, development goals, and our future. To urgently change course, the Commission boldly calls for sexual and reproductive justice. It's an agenda that goes beyond promising sexual and reproductive health and rights. It delivers these in people's lives. To get this agenda moving now, the Commission makes a call for action. New and expanded mechanisms should hold governments and the international community accountable for change. New and expanded movement building, including with young people, civil society, and parliamentarians, must push back against regressive forces. Universal health coverage and stronger health systems should make sexual and reproductive health and rights essential services, and these should be free of charge. Health systems should expand self-care and digital health options that proved successful during the pandemic, while taking deliberate steps to close the digital divide. Sexual and reproductive justice is a rallying cry that will inspire many. The Commission considers it the surest route to closing inequalities and gender gaps, to being resilient to crisis, and to making demographics work for development. Sexual and reproductive justice is how we realize sexual and reproductive health and rights for all, for good. No exceptions, no exclusions.
Thank you for broadcasting this video. I think it's very important to remark that, yes, there has been some progress that has been noted, but also, yes, looking back at this, at how the pandemic has hit us and how it has cut funding for certain services, and also, yes, people having access to their sexual and reproductive health and rights is very important to highlight. So we will be discussing that just now. It has been highlighted at the Nairobi Summit on ICPD 25 that sexual and reproductive justice and health and rights rather is including continued action on HIV/AIDS are a core part of the Sustainable Development Goals, which with dedicated action by 2030. Young people in particular can face multiple intersecting obstacles to sexual and reproductive health information and services related to age, as well as disabilities, gender diversity, sexual orientation, and ethnicity, among others. So to speak about how we have been progressing on the access to SRHR, we will now have two amazing speakers. I'll ask them to please briefly introduce themselves before we move on to the conversation. Please, Saskia Schelleken, if I pronounce that correctly.
Very well. Thank you so much, Sophia, and greetings to all. It's really a pleasure to join you today. Thanks also to the Office of the SDG's Envoy on Youth, the UN Independent Expert on SOGI, the ILGA World and Global Queer Youth Network, as well as She Decides for inviting me for this event. My name is Saskia Schelleken, and I'm the Global Coordinator on the ICPD 25 follow-up at UNFPA, the UN Population Fund. And in this role, I lead the secretariat that supports the high-level commission on the Nairobi Summit on the ICPD 25 follow-up. So I'm not a commissioner, but I'm the lead of that secretariat, just to clarify that role. And in this role, beyond serving the high-level commission, I also lead the coordination internally in UNFPA in terms of our engagement with partners and stakeholders in the follow-up on their voluntary Nairobi commitments. I have worked in the UN system for about 2 decades now, and maybe for full disclosure here as well to let you know that up till 2019 I served as the special advisor to the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. And returned to UNFPA just following the Nairobi Summit. I'm really looking forward to today's event. It's extremely timely, as Julia also already mentioned. More so also because we are continuing to mark the 2nd anniversary of the Nairobi Summit. And just last week saw the launch of the High-Level Commission's first ever report, No Exceptions, No Exclusions, Realizing Sexual Reproductive Health, Rights and Justice for All, which very nicely followed onto the UNFPA State of World Population report that Julia highlighted, which focused on bodily autonomy this year, My Body is My Own. Maybe just to mention very briefly before we start that I'm also extremely delighted to be part of this discussion together with my colleague Álvaro Bermejo, who's a commissioner on the High-Level Commission, and of course well known as the Director General for IPPF, but also wanted to mention that the youth envoy of the Secretary General, as well as Martin Kartasov, who is a board member of ILGA, but also the chair of the youth steering group at ILGA, are also amongst some of our many distinguished commissioners, just to let people know at the outset of this event. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion and having the opportunity to highlight a bit more the content of the Commission's first report that since the launch last week, where it was presented by the co-chairs of the High-Level Commission, President Kikwete, the former president of Tanzania, and Her Excellency Michel Jean, the former Governor General of Canada, and also the former Secretary General of the Francophonie, and presented to the UNFPA Executive Director, Dr. Natalia Kanem. Since then, we have seen like a huge following of this online event, but also people I think are keenly interested in learning more about the report. And as we are digging through it and learning more about its findings and recommendations, it's a great opportunity to engage with you all today to highlight more of this in our discussion today. Back to you, Sophia.
Thank you, Saskia, for all of these remarks and introductions. And now, please, Álvaro Bermejo.
Thank you, Sophia. My name is Álvaro Bermejo. I'm the Director General of the International Planned Parenthood Federation, IPPF, a very large global provider of sexual and reproductive health services and a champion of sexual and reproductive rights around the world. I guess I'm here in that capacity, but more, as Saskia mentioned, as one of the commissioners on this commission that was put together after Nairobi to provide follow-up to the 12 global commitments and the over 1,300 national commitments that were made there, and to make sure that those promises are more than a promise, that they really turn into action as we go forward, and they help us accelerate in achieving the objectives of ICPD. So great pleasure to be with you all and to represent other commissioners as well as I can, who Saskia has mentioned a couple of them. We had a very, very diverse group, and I think that is the power of it and what has allowed us to come up with a report that I think we all feel very proud of. Thank you.
Thank you, Álvaro. And yes, just precisely to start with that, could you please talk about the process of developing the ICPD 25 progress report? Maybe Saskia, could we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I think to reflect on the process of developing the report, and maybe also for the benefit of maybe this somewhat younger audience, and some of whom may not have even been born by the time that ICPD came around. So I understand you're from 1995 yourself, Sophia. Just to mention that all this started, of course, at a groundbreaking international conference on population and development that took place in Cairo in 1994. It was there where 179 governments decided that, that they would drastically change the approach to issues of population and development, and that no longer demographic targets would be leading policies around population and development, but rather that people's intrinsic rights to decide themselves and freely and responsibly on the number of children they want, their, when they want to marry, with whom they want to marry, all these issues that are so core to exercising our agency and our bodily autonomy are to lead, the world forward on a path to sustainable development. So this was truly groundbreaking at the time, putting human rights at the center and putting people's dignity and rights, central to demographic and development targets. So this happened more than 25 years ago now. The Nairobi Summit on ICPD 25, which was held a quarter century later, was not just about celebrating that history, but as President Kikwete last week also during the launch event specifically mentioned, it was also about making history again and once more, and also about very much how do we continue to advance that unfinished business that is still there from the ICPD agenda. The summit, which was co-convened by the governments of Denmark and Kenya together with UNFPA, was about translating the lessons learned of that past into a new roadmap going forward into the future, and also about bringing that future along with us. So Nairobi saw a massive outpouring of support, as the video also mentioned. Over 8,300 participants from all walks of life, government, civil society, the private sector, international NGOs, the UN system, but also very crucially youth leaders from all across the world. We had over 1,200 youth fellowships that were sponsored to attend the conference. So Nairobi really re-energized the global movement for sexual and reproductive health and rights, and it was a critical opportunity to, assess the achievements, but also to identify what were the remaining gaps and to come up with a credible framework for tracking future progress. And as Alvaro mentioned, it saw this 1,300 voluntary commitments presented by governments as well as by other stakeholders. And all of this is encapsulated in the Nairobi Statement, which reflects on 12 core overarching global commitments that was widely endorsed by participants of the summit. So at the conclusion of the summit, and really, also, of course, very encouraged by that voluntary coming forward with all these commitments. UNFPA Executive Director Natalia Kanem committed to establishing the high-level commission, which would then help us ensure that the implementation of those commitments can be indeed tracked and regularly reported on. So as soon as we came out of Nairobi, basically, unfortunately, the world was hit by COVID-19. Many countries went into lockdowns, but despite all that, the organization was not deterred, and the high-level commission was inaugurated on Zoom in September of 2020, so last year. So in addition to the two co-chairs who I just already briefly mentioned, the commission includes a range of distinguished individuals from royalty to academia, civil society, private sector, foundations, parliamentarians, ministers, and also many youth leaders from across the world, and really kind of reflects again, that broad participation that we saw happening in Nairobi. It's an independent commission and an independent advisory body, and the individuals that serve on it are there in their individual capacities. The commission is autonomous in that sense from the United Nations or any other parties. And as it's, I think, clear for everyone, it's mandated to come out on an annual basis with a report on the progress made with the implementation of the 12 core Nairobi commitments, which is then submitted to UNFPA, but obviously also as a very public facing type of report that hopefully will attract a lot of attention and inspire further action. So maybe a little bit more on the process of the commission. And once it was established, the commission was very clear to us as the Secretariat that they wanted to have full ownership on the report and that they wanted it to be bold and forward-looking. They took that task very seriously, and over the past year reflected, I think, very thoroughly on their role, but also kept forging ahead with, making sure, as Alvaro mentioned, that the Nairobi promises are promises kept. I would say that in terms of the process, they were also very methodological how they went about it. We had a number of meetings throughout the year for the full commission, but also there was an approach chosen to set up some sub working groups around the 3 zeros, the zeros of zero maternal, preventable maternal deaths, zero unmet need for family planning, and zero sexual and gender-based violence and harmful practices, which really offered opportunities for this large group, there are 27 commissioners, to actually come together in smaller groups and have more in-depth discussions. And the inputs generated from those discussions then fed into a number of papers, which eventually then also helped develop the broader report. Maybe also to mention that in addition to those 3 working groups, there was a working group established around the development of the global monitoring framework for the 12 commitments, which is presented in the back of the report as an annex, as a traffic light system. It provides an overview of key indicators that were identified that can help the Commission track and the global community really track how each of the commitments is being advanced in the various regions. At the moment, the traffic lights look very red and orange, which is rather concerning, meaning that there's still a long way to go in advancing the commitments. But in a way, it also offers a very strong and powerful accountability tool that can help advance the Commission in its work, and offers a baseline as the Commission will work on future reports that will come in the next years. And the interesting about it, thing, maybe just to briefly mention about this monitoring framework, is that it doesn't just pull on very well established international indicators that we have vastly available in the UN for instance, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, or that we draw from the demographic health surveys and mixed surveys, but also it brings in indicators that perhaps are somewhat more unusual to the UN, which are, for instance, indicators around LGBTQI, where we very much looked at the work undertaken by ILGA World and indicators that are available for that. So I think maybe just to say, with all of these different strands of work, then eventually and the support of a lead author and very close coordination with the Secretariat and the continuous engagement of the commissioners in the review process of the various drafts of the report, we then arrived at the product, no exceptions, no exclusions, realizing sexual and reproductive health, rights and justice for all, as it was launched last week. So I can stop here. I hope there's still something for Alvaro to also reflect on, and I didn't take too much time here. But yeah, it has been a very interesting process, and I think, as Alvaro said, a very inclusive process with a lot of strong engagement from the commissioners throughout the whole year.
Yes, thank you very much, Saskia, for sharing with us this big picture and the context of this report. So thank you very much for that. Alvaro, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I think it's been very comprehensive. The only thing maybe I would add was that the Commission really used its voice to call for listening to other voices in all their diversity. And the working groups, the one I had the fortune to co-chair with Lawrence Kabasele, the president of AfriYan for East and Southern Africa, from DRC, very clearly the Commission said and articulated that if we were going to base the report and frame it around sexual and reproductive justice, which is the way we have framed it, then we needed to be hearing women, adolescents, and youth, and people with diverse genders and identities, and really all those who remain furthest from realizing their rights. And we needed to be listening and feeding that into the Commission and into the report. And the working groups helped do that. And the fact that many of us in our organizations, in our day-to-day, are sort of connected to to those voices and listening. We could bring that and channel it to the best you can. Of course, it's always imperfect and all of that, but that was a very clear mandate from the commission to the individual commissioners to try and bring that in. And I guess it's now for the reader really to say whether we managed or not. But that was very much a deliberate effort.
Great, thank you for sharing that as well. And yeah, so also we have already some questions from the audience. And that also goes with the next question that we had planned, which was about if you would like to comment on any surprising findings of the report and challenges still to overcome, which also joins the questions from the audience, which is someone asks, says, recommendations focus on pushing back against regression of human rights. And this person is wondering what practical steps can be taken to take up this recommendation seriously, tracking the attacks on human rights defenders and ensuring their protection. And another question is, this person fears that Nairobi is being forgotten and is asking what we can do what can we do more to keep groundbreaking commitments alive and make commitment makers accountable? So please, Alvaro, would you like to share on this?
Yes, I'll try and respond sort of simultaneously to the surprises and those two questions, maybe. You know, I would say two things surprised me the most. Maybe the first one was how quickly we came as a commission to realize the dramatic way in which COVID had exposed what we started calling the fragility of the right, of the R in SRHR. So how fragile the rights part of SRHR had proven to be through the pandemic. And chapter 1 of the report is very much about that. And in it, the Commission decries upfront how the COVID pandemic has, in a way, demonstrated the ease with which countries set aside hard-gained sexual and reproductive health and rights in favor of other priorities. And I'm not talking just of those who are known for resisting progress towards gender equality and have used the pandemic as an excuse to try and roll them back. The Commission wasn't just talking about Morawiecki's Poland or Orban's Hungary. We were also talking about those who have in the past been supportive, who we thought were on our side, and whose moral and political failure has been made evident with the pandemic in eroding services, in lost financing, and in diminishing political accountability for sexual and reproductive health and rights around the world. The likes of the Johnson's UK government. The Commission stresses in the report very strongly that now is not the time to invoke austerity and to disinvest in sexual and reproductive health and rights. That continued and increased investment is a matter of rights, of justice, and of development overall, and is backed by long-standing evidence of high returns on these investments. So that was maybe the first surprise, how such a diverse commission could very quickly coalesce around that. The second issue for me was around what I mentioned at the beginning, how quickly we realized that if you were to respond to the way in which COVID-19 had exacerbated, disparities, abuse based on gender, race, disability, and other parameters, the recognition of these intersecting inequalities and injustice required a global agenda for sexual and reproductive justice that builds, as Julia has said, on realizing rights and bodily autonomy by overcoming all these intersecting barriers. And this was needed more than ever after Nairobi. And the report also highlights that an agenda for sexual and reproductive justice requires an inclusive definition of gender, embracing diverse orientations and identity. Those two things for me were, to some extent, surprise. We did address the issue that is being picked up by one of our colleagues sort of listening in around the protection of sexual and reproductive health providers as human rights defenders and of activists in SRHR and LGBT rights as human rights defenders. And, you know, one of the things the Commission was very clear and is in there in the report is the need to get much better at documenting the systematic increase in these violations, product of an opposition that is not just better financed than ever, but that is more aggressive and more violent than it has ever been. And that is reflected in the Commission's thinking and in the report as well. In terms of how to keep the momentum alive, what the Commission sort of will continue doing as per its mandate, Saskia just mentioned that, is producing a report every year, participating in these dialogues and in these discussions, and pushing, if you want, the accountability framework that Saskia also mentioned, sort of makes the annex to the report. But we need to do more, that is for sure. And the proposal in the Commission, and it highlights 12 countries, more than 12 countries, more than a dozen countries that have made good progress in terms of setting up national accountability mechanisms. It also asks that the UPR mechanism and the SDG reviews, annual reporting mechanism, are utilized also to report against the Nairobi commitments, and in that sense to keep the discussion going and to keep the pressure on those that made commitments. I'll stop there because I know there are going to be more questions, and I'm sure Saskia has to add to this one as well.
Yes, precisely. Thank you very much. Saskia, would you like to comment on this, on these questions?
Well, I think Alvaro has said a lot, and yeah, indeed, you know, I think what is also very clear and strong coming out from the report is, of course, not addressing SRHR issues has detrimental impacts on people's rights and their personal health, but also has, you know, impacts on social justice overall and the opportunities to achieve the SDG agenda. So the failure to accelerate action undermines health and human rights, but also the opportunities to reduce poverty and other agendas. And there again, I think again, we can really look at how the various agendas are so interconnected with each other. I just wanted to pick up on maybe the issue of accountability for the Nairobi commitments. And indeed, Alvaro mentioned that the report does also highlight you know, not just only, you know, the bad, but also somewhat the good, and really tries to, you know, also reflect on where progress has been made. And the report in that sense picks up on the national committees that have been established with governments and other stakeholders at country level to have a continuous opportunity to come together and reflect on the implementation of the voluntary national commitments. Also in the context of the UPR, the Universal Periodic Reviews at the Human Rights Council, we have actually seen really good traction with Nairobi commitments, where the majority of countries that have since the Nairobi summit been going through the process of the peer reviews have indeed, you know, been, you know, also reviewed on how they have advanced their own Nairobi commitments, and, you know, from other countries part of the Human Rights Council received recommendations, and we see that in the context of that follow-up, they usually adopt those recommendations as well, which gives them a 4-year period at country level to really, you know, work with the national human rights institutions to make those commitments a reality. So I think that's a really good accountability mechanism that links the global with the local. We do want to see more in the context of the high-level political forum, I would say, and very much also in the national voluntary review processes there. Unfortunately, there, I think a lot more can still be done. I wanted to say also maybe more on the side of the positive. The Commission also very much, I think, looked into where services, despite all the challenges that of course apparently are there due to the COVID-19 pandemic, did actually make some progress in terms of adopting new innovative approaches, using new technologies, also through telemedicine and other approaches. Actually, we have sometimes also seen that these innovations help us to reach the populations that sometimes had been left behind. So there are some good things and potential to be further explored around those issues as well. And I think that the report does a good job in terms of highlighting the good and the bad, and indeed, be very comprehensive in that sense. I thought to just add that on, but generally, obviously, there is a lot of work to be done still, and that many partners around the world and those connecting to this conversation today will continue to talk the walk and walk the talk with us as we continue the march on the Nairobi commitments.
Thank you, Saskia. And yes, precisely to stay on the positive side, or any progress that the report shows, I would like to ask you one final question before we close this segment, which is about precisely coming back to LGBTIQ youth. What does the report show when it comes to this population? Does it show any progress or challenges? Alvaro, would you like to start with this?
Sure, gracias, Sofia. Yes. There were multiple Nairobi commitments that promised to improve the health and well-being of youth and adolescents in general. And what the Commission sort of sees is that partly because of the COVID pandemic, we fear that the next generation, in a way, those that are small kids now that will be adolescents sort of in 2030, and we're already facing many challenges before the pandemic, are slipping backwards. And we had a lot of evidence of that. Some of it, I have to say, provided by the African Queer Youth Initiative, and I'd like to give them a shout out here, which really highlight the severe impact of the pandemic on young queer people's lives in Africa. So that was the context in which we were looking at the results, at progress. And you said you wanted just good news, but let me tell you a little bit what I see as the three main commitments, sort of as they affect LGBTQI youth. Commitment 4 is access for all adolescents and youth, especially girls, to comprehensive and age-responsive information, education, and adolescent-friendly, comprehensive, quality, and timely services to be available for free and to make informed decisions and choices about their sexuality and reproductive lives. This commitment, when we look at the indicators, at the dashboard that we created, is red in Central and Southern Asia and in Africa. And it's orange and yellow elsewhere. It is nowhere green. So a lot of progress missing there. Commitment 5 was to achieve zero gender-based violence and harmful practices. And yet we know that gender-based violence became known as the shadow pandemic. So not surprisingly, we find a mix of yellows and oranges, but again, no greens, zero greens. And then commitment 9 is the one furthest behind of all 12 commitments. It only has orange and red across all regions. And this is the commitment to building peaceful, just, and inclusive societies where no one is left behind, where all are able to shape their own destiny and contribute to the prosperity of their societies. So I would say what the report shows, honestly, is the terrible impact on queer adolescents who experience double marginalization in pursuit of sexual and reproductive health services as adolescents and as queer. So I think in reflecting, we need to start from there, from acknowledging, I would say as an individual, but also as IPPF, the organization I lead, that we have to do better than we've done since Nairobi. And I say this as the starting point because at the same time, we have tried in the Commission to point to positive developments. And you can see many examples of brilliant services, some of them within IPPF, like bridging schools and clinics, innovative self-managed care, inclusive in and out of school comprehensive sexuality education using digital technologies, impactful LGBTI advocacy. So there's enough there not to despair, but I think we need to understand that we are falling very, very short. That is, I'm afraid, the reality and why we need to maintain the activism, sort of strong, and make sure that this young generation that is leading a lot of the LGBT advocacy, at least the one I encounter as director of IPPF, these youth-led LGBT organizations lead the charge, and that we see ourselves as commissioners or as established SRHR organizations supporting that and providing platforms and support. That's where I see us going in the next few years.
Thank you, Alvaro. And we're just a couple of minutes over the time established for this segment, but Saskia, would you like to share some comments to close this section?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think Alvaro covered a lot, and indeed, I think there are a number of commitments amongst the 12 core overarching commitments in the Nairobi Statement that are particularly linked to the experiences and the lives of young people, and specifically mention young people as part of their commitment. But I think overall, all the commitments in one way or another are really critical for young people and relevant for their lives. There is one commitment specifically around also young people's meaningful engagement and involvement in any decisions that affect their lives, really in line with the Nairobi Statement overall and on ICPD 25 and these 12 core commitments. We need to really include and engage young people in all their diversity in any decisions that affect our lives, no exceptions, no exclusions. And I think this is a really good, start in a way, or it's not the start, obviously, we've worked for a long time together, but really to ensure that we bring the various agendas and movements together. And I really think that, as was also mentioned by Julia in some way, now by Alvaro again, that we see these convergences of justice movements all across. It's SRHR and LGBTQI. You won't get SRHR without LGBTQI issues being addressed. You won't achieve gender justice without paying attention and ensuring that sexual reproductive rights and justice are achieved. Climate justice is not going to happen without gender justice, as we just saw a week ago in Glasgow, and I think was more predominantly there on the agenda than it has ever been before. And I think all these, these movements and agendas are becoming more and more crystallized and clear that we need each other, and we need to really join forces there around them. I'm really thrilled to work with the Commission and work around this report, but already looking forward to the work going forward, and indeed very much hoping that we will have plenty opportunities for joining up forces with all key partners involved in today's event and beyond, and especially bringing in those voices of the younger generations in all their diversity, because they're the ones that need to own the ICPD agenda. Even if maybe this happened before you were born, the issues are still very much there and are very critical to everyone's lives and everyone's well-being. So maybe I can just stop there. I would be very happy to share with you in the chat the links for the report and also the link to the launch event last week for those that haven't had a chance yet to see it. The report, maybe just a very practical note, is available in French and English, and then also there are executive summaries in Arabic, English, French, Spanish, and Russian. So for anyone interested, please don't hesitate also to reach out to us at UNFPA and the ICP25 Secretariat. And again, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Saskia. Would you like Alvaro to share some closing words just for the second?
No, I know we're out of time, and I think I've had a chance to really say what I wanted to say. So thank you. I really think that we need to work together much more in all spaces, including humanitarian spaces, where again SRHR and LGBTQI issues are more dramatic than ever, and that the two movements have a lot to add to each other and to contribute to each other, accepting sort of, I still think the leadership of the young queer led organizations is something that we need more of within the SRHR space. And we very much welcome all of you that have put this event together. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for sharing such brilliant comments and for sharing all of these results of the report. I absolutely agree. I think that actually all of the LGBTIQ movement can be enmarked within the SRHR movement. It's just that usually within the SRHR movement, we don't usually have this perspective of people who are other than cis and heterosexual. So I think, yes, absolutely, they can very much be mashed up together. And so once again, thank you very much for sharing all of this with us. We will now move to our second segment, which is named My Body, My Rights, Our Freedom, LGBTIQ and SRHR Youth in Action, where we will talk with young activists that have been working on the intersection between the LGBTIQ and SRHR movements. So please, I would like our different panelists to introduce themselves. I would like to start with Sadie Brown, if you are over here. Or maybe Georgia, please, or sorry, I think, Sadie, are you there? I can see you.
Can you see me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, okay, hello everyone. Hello everyone, my name is Sadie Brown. I am a She Decides 25 by 25 young leader, and I'm based in South Africa.
Thank you, Sadie. I would now like Georgia to introduce herself, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Georgia Andrews. My pronouns are she, her. I am an intersex activist based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Just a bit of background about myself. I have been involved in intersex advocacy on a global level for the past 7 years. Highlights of my intersex journey have included partnership projects that I have supported following United Nations recommendations to the New Zealand government. So I have been engaged in non-government organisation and government conversations as the first out intersex person in New Zealand within the youth space. I am really honoured to be here today. It is an absolute pleasure to be sitting alongside Michael and Sadie and such a phenomenal group of people here today. Intersex issues are so often forgotten in conversations around sexual and reproductive health rights. And I feel as an intersex and lesbian woman, there are so many intersections which I'm really excited to share today. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia. And finally, Michael.
Thank you. So my name is Michael Chiunda, and I am an activist in Stockholm. I currently work with RFSL Stockholm, which is a chapter of a bigger national queer organization. I've experienced with Chalkback, which is also an intersectional feminist queer organization globally, and we have about 150 members and chapters throughout the world, and some of my experience as well as in SRHR and activism within Southern Africa and globally, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for introducing yourselves. It's a pleasure to be speaking here with you today. And so, if that's okay with you, I would like to start directly with the conversation. We have a lot to discuss over a half hour. So, first of all, of course, we have already talked in the first segment about the impact of the pandemics, but I would like to hear from you. What do you think, or rather, how do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the barriers on LGBTIQ youth in our access to SRHR around the world? So I would like to start with Sadie, if that's okay with you. Sadie, can you hear me?
Sophia, can you please repeat the question?
Yes, sorry. How do you think that the pandemic has increased the barriers for LGBTIQ youth in our access to SRHR?
Okay, I do think that the COVID pandemic has increased the barriers that were already in place for queer people who are based all over the world. We are people who are only subjected to literally the bottom of the barrel when it comes to accessing services, when it comes to being prioritized as young people who are queer. And what we saw with the whole pandemic happen was that there was a lot of exclusion of queer young people. I'm a queer young person myself, and what happened is that I even started really speaking more openly about the exclusion of queer young people who are living with HIV as a queer young person living with HIV, and how queer women are constantly being erased and removed from conversations about HIV. So I got to realize that for a lot of the times we got quite excluded and kind of forgotten from the priorities where the pandemic was concerned.
Thank you, Sadie. What about you, Georgia? What would you add to this?
I agree with Sadie. I think that the COVID pandemic has only highlighted the limited support that our LGBTQIA communities have in sexual and reproductive health rights spaces. For a number of my global intersex friends, there have been massive impacts from COVID, starting off with unemployment, meaning that individuals have not been able to pay rent, so they have become homeless, and then they have not been able to afford support for medical interventions, life-preserving interventions, whether that is medication or access to medical care or surgical care that is life-preserving. And that is particularly concerning, given that our governments have known and voices have been raised in this space by youth communities around how challenging it is for intersex people to gain access to health rights that they need. Yet governments are now using the excuse in some countries of COVID as a delay or a barrier to continuing conversations and dialogue with young people. I think too, for intersex people, hormone replacement therapy is a key part to some people's healthcare regimes. And in order to guarantee positive sexual and reproductive health outcomes for some individuals, hormone access is needed. COVID has closed factories globally, and a lot of people have been without medications, which is particularly concerning and puts sexual and reproductive health at risk.
Thank you, Georgia. I think it's very important that you highlight the challenges that intersex people face, because it's usually not the most visible part of the LGBTIQ population in general. So it's very valuable that you can share about all this. And Michael, would you like to add anything to this question?
Yeah, so I have a unique experience of the whole thing because during the COVID, I was able to travel in between two very distinct continents, to say the least, because I was in part of Southern Africa in the beginning of 2019. And in the middle of 2019, I was now in Sweden, and I've experienced different communities talking about, for example, in Zimbabwe, the abortion laws are completely different. We have around 614 deaths per 10,000 when it comes to maternal mortality rate, which is one of the highest in the world, according to the UN. And also when it comes to, I think similar to Georgia's experience around hormonal therapy, that's non-existent in Zimbabwe. And I guess during the pandemic, it only made it worse, the people's access. Then one general reality is the funding is towards MSM. So that's males who have sex with males and trans persons. So anyone else who's outside of the out of that group has no access to these rights. But it's pretty different from Sweden and Stockholm, because it's not, I mean, access is there, but I guess when it comes to the actual conversation between different ethnicities and people who have different privileges, that's when you see the impact of COVID-19 and who has access to what kind of information in what language and what community you come from. So I guess I'll just say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And it's important that you highlight how politics that may be aimed towards, like a whole LGBTQI population, for example, may prioritize certain segments, as you just mentioned, maybe like what would correspond to gay men or just men who have sex with other men, and etc. I think it's important to, yes, highlight how it's not a homogeneous population. We have different needs within it. So thank you for sharing that. I would now like to ask you, what are some examples of initiatives that have been focusing on LGBTIQ youth and their sexual and reproductive rights? Like maybe you have certain examples of good practices in your countries or regions that you would like to talk about. Sadie, would you like to start?
Yes. In the previous year also, I have been a part of She Decides, and we have been given the platform to pretty much advocate for the things that really matter to us. And we have, because we are such huge advocates of our right to bodily autonomy, it has been quite important for us to also intersect our own personal beliefs or our own personal things that we advocate or believe in into body autonomy. So that is pretty much how I also got to kind of intersect my HIV advocacy into my journey as a queer young person living with HIV. So that has been a great example that I could mention. Another thing has been there are quite a few NGOs in my country where they have different programs. One that comes top to mind is this amazing campaign that is meant for men who have sex with other men, and pretty much they go out into the communities, seek those men, test them for HIV, initiate them on treatment, and make sure that they retain them on treatment for HIV. So that has also been quite phenomenal for me to see and to just look at. I love how it has been important that we intersect other issues that queer young people go through beyond them just being queer young people. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadie. Georgia from New Zealand, would you like to share anything?
Since 2017, I have been involved in government conversations in regards to intersex health rights. So the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and the UN Committee Against Torture acknowledged that there has been a lack of focus to bodily autonomy and self-determination rights for intersex people in New Zealand. So the New Zealand government, alongside the Paediatric Society of New Zealand and the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, established an intersex roundtable group to bring in clinicians, community members, and intersex allies to navigate pathways forward for enhancing the levels of care and support in those areas. A barrier that was identified was that there were only 2 intersex people invited into the space, and I was the only youth representative in a group speaking on behalf of all intersex youth in the country. So that was a significant challenge. The progress from that point forward was following the roundtable conversations. New Zealand government, alongside the Paediatric Society of New Zealand, funded a 2-year program to meet to establish a terms of reference for young people. So the framing was child and youth, so from 0 years to 18 years old. Limitations with that space were clinicians felt that there was not enough time available to discuss youth issues. So youth issues were completely taken off the table. And although the UN recommendations stated we needed youth issues to be spoken about and addressed, they were effectively forgotten over the course of the 2 years. In positive news, on Intersex Awareness Day on the 26th of October 2021, the New Zealand government acknowledged that there is still a long way to go in supporting the rights and needs of intersex people, particularly focusing on an all-of-life care model, looking at the impacts for sexual and reproductive health when interventions, both hormonal and surgical, are undertaken against young people. We must focus as a country on what those impacts are for those people as they become older, because the statistics we see for poor levels of sexual health and reproductive health as a result of medical interventions are particularly concerning, alongside a failure to acknowledge the psychosocial health outcomes and implications that sit alongside those interventions.
Thank you, Georgia. Michael, would you like to share?
Yeah, sure. 2019, around January and February, I was part of a bigger national conversation in Zimbabwe around queer issues and their bodies. And in that regard, because most of the members and most of the people who are having discussions happen to be queer, but also this was at the ground level. Which is similar to most of the NGOs. So I mentioned the MSM programs. Those programs on the ground level, they're for queer people, and that's a positive in terms of the initiative. But when you look at the structure of these organizations that are spearheading these programs, it's generally folk who are not queer, and that creates more of a gap in the actual positive nature of the program. Here in Sweden, I've been part of, like I mentioned, RFSL Stockholm, and I guess one of the major highlights that I've experienced is how we've been able to create safe spaces, especially in art and mental health, because I work with refugees mainly. So I suppose those are some of the initiatives that are there. And I know in Zimbabwe, they are working with an organization, a collective called Harare Queers. And it's mainly for social events and helping each other understand some of their rights. And there's some legal and more practical activities that they'll also host, which is a very interesting and progressive way, especially considering the political state of Zimbabwe right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And you have already talked about this a bit, but I think that, well, you mentioned that governments are lagging behind their commitments, and yes, just like ensuring that sexual and reproductive health and rights are guaranteed for our population. But there's also the challenge that maybe there are some governments that are progressive, at least in discourse, and they can commit to these, to these subjects or problematics or populations. But in some other countries, we see that there are more challenges for, making governments talk about this and committing themselves to these causes, right? So I would like to ask you if from within civil society and young activists movements, have you noticed any strategies that are aimed towards governments so that they can indeed, yes, dare to talk about this and engage themselves in all of this? Again, we can start with Sadie and then Georgia and then Michael.
Okay, so where the government is concerned here in South Africa, it really there haven't been any efforts that have been put in place to kind of make sure that queer people get a life that they deserve, in the sense that literally here in South Africa, there usually are those periods where queer young people get murdered, and we are subjected to so much hate, and constantly we've had to literally fight and use social media and be like, why are we not being noticed? People are being murdered and no one is saying anything about it. So where the government is concerned, I wouldn't really say that there's much that is being done. I would say though that the civil society here in South Africa and the different organizations really, according to me, really put in the work to kind of make sure that they create safe spaces for young people who are queer, and to just make sure that we have that sense of community, because it really gets difficult. I mean, one thing that we really shouldn't even get accustomed to, but it is the reality of a lot of queer people, is homophobia and queerphobia and transphobia and all these other phobias that you literally get subjected to just by virtue of you being a queer person. So it gets quite difficult to constantly have to fight, constantly have to say, I deserve to exist in a world where everyone else is existing, and you also have to like justify why your existence is so important, and it needs to be valid just like someone else. So honestly, I don't think much has been done where the government is concerned. I would though say that we do try as queer people in South Africa and the civil society and organizations to just make sure that we take it upon ourselves to create these spaces. Of course, there's only so much that we can do because we don't really have the power that the government does have, but we take it upon ourselves to try to implement these spaces that we would like to see being implemented by our government.
Thank you, Sadie. What you just said just resonated a lot with me, because in Latin America, we have also high levels of violence against, just like high levels of violence in general, but also against queer people and women. And so, but there's this difference that, for example, at least the Mexican government is committed to ending these sorts of hate crimes and discrimination. However, despite having a government that is rather progressive, at least in discourse, we can't see that change in reality where people are still being murdered and abused and everything. So yes, thank you for sharing that. What about you, Georgia?
New Zealand's in a unique position that we have the highest representation of queer identified members of parliament in the world. So there is a broad discussion around LGBTI rights. In saying that, to date, there is still no formal legal protection specifically supporting intersex people and communities. Within the youth space, like I said, there's very few of us who are out in New Zealand, but we have felt that we need to advocate for ourselves and show best practice procedures for government. Examples of that include walking into medical schools at universities around the country and partnering with lecturers to establish lecture programs and course assessment that covers the rights of intersex people and doesn't leave intersex narratives forgotten, particularly when we're working with young clinicians who are walking into a medical space where quite often they don't even know who intersex people are or how to support them. If we don't break those barriers at that point of education and training, how are we going to see systemic change across the country? So we're feeding this information back to government, telling them about the impacts that these conversations are having, not only on intersex health outcomes, but also on the confidence our clinicians have to step forward and support more positive conversations. Also, mainstream media is huge. The New Zealand society is small, and we are proud of the way in which we can support human rights. So for young activists to go to media, whether that's social media, newspapers, TV, and speak up about our rights, we are heard. And New Zealand wants to be seen as a country that stands above the rest. I guess my final comment in this space is we need to also reflect on what other countries are doing, which is possibly different from us. I've been partnering with my friend Steph Lum, who's Australian based. Steph is the founder and editor of Youth and I, which is an anthology series looking at global intersex issues. We are launching our youth publication on December 2nd, but it highlights stories from intersex young people all around the world. It is translated into individuals' native languages as well as English. And we are using that as a story to share with communities around how we can celebrate and support narratives that are often not talked about. And excitingly, we have some young people that have contributed stories about sexual and reproductive rights and health access.
Thank you, Georgia. And Michael?
So in Zimbabwe, the government before 2017 was very brutal when it came to sexualities and different sexualities in the community. But right now, the legislature is a little bit silent. So it's open to interpretation by if it's a police officer that you meet or it's someone on the street, but there's a huge culture of sexual harassment, street sexual harassment, sexual assault. So legally, they claim you might have protection, but in every day, it's a whole completely different story. But there has been some positives when it comes to like the civil societies, because like I mentioned, they are NGOs, they are collectives of people who are coming together in solidarity and deciding to push for a specific movement that they believe in. And I think one major attractive, positive thing is ownership of, like I mentioned, there's a whole lot of sexual harassment. So ownership of some of these words, some of these meeting places, and obviously at the back of their minds, always trying to be safe, but there's a lot of solidarity and ownership. And because of the civil groups, there's also support from like legal practitioners, independent legal practitioners. So I feel in that way, there's a whole lot of movement since 2017, but in relation to most countries around us, most countries around Zimbabwe, we're still way back. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And we actually got a comment from the audience, which is, someone said, I think the research community has a role to play. There is a huge need in providing more information and data about LGBTQI people. Some government officials believe these people do not exist in certain contexts. And I agree. I think, at least in Mexico, we are always pushing to get more data and include our populations, or rather visibilize our population within population census in general, or making more, just generally more research. It's very important to have data in order to push for public policies that can address our needs. So yes, absolutely. Also, now if we could focus maybe on actions that we could further for the future, so we can talk about this in the last 10 minutes of this conversation. let me just start by remarking that the UN Youth Strategy has as one of its priorities to leverage the UN's advocacy and programmatic capacities to expand young people's access to youth-friendly and rights-based sexual and reproductive health services, comprehensive sexuality education, and information. So all of this can be useful for this cause, but also, yes, like looking to the future, what actions still need to be taken to really guarantee young people's access to SRHR all over the world? So if you would like, we can start like backwards, maybe with Michael and then Georgia and then Sadie this time.
Okay, great. I think the most important thing is education, especially in the context of Zimbabwe. And we have a very vibrant youth. That's the thing. Like, we have a very vibrant youth, and young people below the age of 25 are very open-minded. And if there's like more education around that and what that means to be in your sexuality, then I feel the issue around the rights and your health is the next step. So I suppose more information that's directed towards that demographic that's relevant for them. And I think to focus more on those communities. So for example, in Zimbabwe, as opposed to trying to go to traditional schools, you go into the spaces that they actually hang out and where they're most likely going to listen to, because in my experience, it's usually very formal, and how this information is given to this demographic. And sometimes it's very difficult for someone to listen when they're in school as opposed to when they're just at a hangout spot. So it's working with the age group and presenting a very relevant, fun, but still it is education. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you, Michael. Georgia?
I completely echo that, Michael. Education is fundamental. I think the most problematic area for intersex individuals being able to access sexual and reproductive health support is that clinicians so often globally tell intersex people when they're diagnosed that they should never tell anybody that they're intersex, that their body is shameful, that they are different, that they are othered, and that they should keep their narrative a secret. So if we want young people to feel comfortable to access healthcare and sexual and reproductive health access, we must have conversations from a point of diagnosis where our young people feel like they can celebrate who they are, because we will not see a change in the level of access to health services if our people are too scared to actually step up and say, I feel comfortable saying that, for example, for an intersex person, I want to start a family, I need support with my reproductive health. But if my clinician has told me when I am 8 years old, 10 years old, 16 years old, that my body's shameful, I'm not going to access that. The barrier alongside that is because people aren't accessing these services, we don't have the records to show the numbers of people in our population. So it's the balance of how do we lift up our young people so they feel proud of who they are, they know they're entitled to access support, but we have the data to support the funding to establish necessary services.
Thank you, Georgia. Yes, it's very important to be able to feel, yes, to recognize diversity and be able to, yes, break stigma around all sorts of everything and everyone that goes outside the norm. Thank you. And Sadie, please.
I just think that it's important. I'm literally echoing everything my fellow panelists have been saying. I think it's important that also we feel represented, we feel included in spaces and in these conversations. Literally, we say this all the time, but nothing should be done for us without us in these spaces. And it's important that we keep on being asked and consulted about the things that we think would matter to us and what we think is relevant and what we think could help us in creating a better life for us. So I'm just all for inclusivity, and I just feel like it's important we be just looking at young people and just seeing their stories and seeing them for the holistic human beings that they are. Like, we literally have so much more to offer. We have so many great ideas that we have to offer. So it's important that we just keep giving these opportunities, these spaces, to be able to properly articulate what exactly we want. Regarding the the access to SRHR services in healthcare facilities, I would say that it's important that we have queer-friendly services. But again, I would also like to say that it's very important that we also have queer inclusive services within the already existing healthcare services, because also let's not try to isolate us from the general public. Let us integrate the queer inclusive services into the already existing facilities, so that we also kind of feel like we are a part of the community, because we are, and our existence is valid, and we are human beings, and we are deserving to be existing in the same spaces as everyone else. So I would really like to see queer young people being able to properly articulate themselves. Georgia just mentioned how, like, the difficulty of even having to speak about starting a family. I'm queer and I'm living with HIV, and I don't know how to properly tell a healthcare worker that I'm trying to figure out ways to have safe sex with my partner. And those are not the things that we should be going through as young people. These things should be there. They should be general knowledge. It shouldn't even be a thing, or like a difficult conversation that we have to go through. So it's important that we keep on saying we're here, and we demand and we deserve to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadie. That was brilliant. So yes, I think that we will now be closing this conversation. But yes, I would like to highlight that what you all said, Georgia, Sadie, Michael. I think you highlighted two main things. One is precisely access to information and education that contemplates our diversity, and that, yes, acknowledges us and our rights. And in that sense, we can create a community that is more welcoming, and yes, that is more safe for us to live within, on one end. And on the other one, well, there's the question about services, right? Again, this could derive if we have a general society that is aware of LGBTQI needs and rights and all of these things. We would think that at least health services, and especially sexual and reproductive ones, are aware of our needs and can treat us, again, in a manner that is safe and respectful for all of us. So, and in that same sense, not only services like in the way that we are being treated within health centers or anything like that, but also within the products that we receive, as you said, Sadie, for example, when it comes to safe sex. Like, can we get, like latex barriers for people with vulvas to use? Like, we always have condoms, like external condoms, but can we have access to other barriers and things like that in a more, they are usually more expensive and less likely to be found in pharmacies and stuff like that. So yes, having a more integral and integrative view and perspective in general society about our needs as LGBTQI youth is very important. So thank you very much, everyone, for sharing your very important perspectives from each of your corners of the world. We will now be closing this session. So thank you, everyone who is viewing this. Thank you for joining us on this session of the Queer Youth Dialogues. Remember, this is a year-long campaign, so we hope you continue to join us on the next sessions, and that together we can continue to build a stronger global youth movement for LGBTIQ human rights with more resources, support, and power. please follow our social media channels for more information. And if you're a young person, sign up to the Queer Youth Network's mailing list via the website. We're sharing the link in the chat just now. And so once again, thank you, Georgia, Sadie, and Michael for this conversation. It was a pleasure speaking with you.